Welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Seventh-day Adventist mission to the world. To find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org.
I'm Sam Nevis.
And I'm David Trim. Last episode, Sam, we talked about the crucial role played by the General Conference Secretariat in providing the administrative infrastructure for mission to the world.
But we didn't get to the nitty-gritty of it. So let's take some time today to figure out how Secretariat saw itself in that process, and I guess how they conceptualize mission altogether.
Yeah, that's a great subject, Sam, and the answers are very interesting. And I would say that most fundamentally, Secretariat sought to expand the boundaries of foreign mission. They were entering unentered territories, reaching unreached people groups, as they would be described today. It's not a term that exists 100 years ago.
How did they describe it? Just people.
Just people. But they don't have, so people group today is a way of distinguishing between the different ethnic and cultural groups within a territory.
At the time, I suppose they just said new nations.
Exactly.
Or languages.
We want to reach this country.
Yeah.
But what they want to do is to reach unreached people. And just simply put, foreign mission was the top priority of the General Conference Secretariat. Of course, foreign always implies foreign to where, and of course they were very clear, foreign meant not North America, Europe, or Australasia. Today we would recognize that, for example, Europe is a mission field because it's become so post-Christian. And we wouldn't talk about foreign mission today, we'd talk about global mission or cross-cultural mission or pioneer mission. But however you describe it, that kind of mission was the top priority of the General Conference Secretariat. Not evangelizing in areas where the church was already strong, but reaching places where the church was weak or had no presence at all.
And more recently, there has been a call from Secretariat to see foreign missions from the perspective of everywhere that the church is strong. So if you are in South America, foreign means foreign to South America. Therefore, right. Use whatever God gave you over the years to help impact people elsewhere.
Right. And even though mainland of Southeast Asia is a real challenge for the church, in the Philippines, the islands off the coast of Southeast Asia, the church is immensely strong. And so now we've got missionaries going from the Philippines to other places. So foreign today has a more all-encompassing meaning.
We spent maybe a century focusing on reaching every country in the world. Even when I grew up, there was always that sense, how many countries are we in yet? You know, are we arriving everywhere? So more recently, we talked about people groups, as you mentioned. But back here, it was countries.
Yes.
And there was a full drive to take us to those new countries. Now, what was it like when we got there? Tell me more about that.
Well, I think that needs to be a subject for a different day, because we'd need to go into detail on that. But just coming back to Secretariat, you know, it's interesting that William Spicer, the General Conference Secretary from 1903 to 1922, several of his reports to General Conference sessions are simply his reports. So the Secretary's report, but he simply calls them the Mission Field Outlook. So that tells you that the Secretary thinks his job is the mission field. It's not administration of the church in general. It's not policies, the things that Secretariat is, and with good reason, so involved with today. It's the mission field outlook. That's what the Secretary's report is. And by mission field, he meant those areas outside North America, Central and Western Europe, and Australasia. And the Secretary's report at sessions regularly includes the whole of the world. But Spicer always distinguished between home and foreign fields, home being, again, North America, Europe, and Australasia, and between mission lands and home bases. He spent much of his time talking about the foreign fields, stressing those that had recently been entered or remained unentered, rather than the countries where the church was strong. When he turned to speak of the home fields at length, which he does sometimes, it was, for example, to describe, and he does so very approvingly, of how the North American division was providing 571 out of 708 missionaries in one quinquennium. or how North American conferences were sharing their tithe and promoting the weekly offerings throughout the churches. He said in one report, in every union or local conference, fostering and promoting interests and gifts for missions is a matter of regular conference work into which the laborers put all their hearts and souls. It has revolutionized our foreign missionary enterprise. So he's saying the task of foreign mission, even though Secretariat is taking the lead, is not just one for Secretariat. It's one for local conferences and local churches to get involved in. And that's similar to the Mission Refocus initiative that Secretariat is pushing at the moment.
At the time, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had unions in North America.
Yes.
So there wasn't a particular division. The NAD today, the North American division today, would coordinate those unions. But at the time, it was done
by the General Conference.
By the General Conference.
No, that's correct. It's called the North American Division, but there's no separate North American Division headquarters as there are as in other divisions, and so the unions are coordinated directly by the General Conference. But as far as Spicer was concerned, because the homelands had been organized into unions, they required little attention. They should just be able to get on with managing themselves. We've talked about this before. The role of the General Conference was mission, and so Spicer's primary interest in the home fields was as sources of financial support for and personnel to serve in foreign mission fields.
So the General Conference then served this crucial role of extending the resources and the influence and the mission of the Adventist Church to areas that did not have it.
Right. And what's more, there was a very strong focus on what we would today call world religions. So I would say for the first 60 years of the 20th century, Secretariat had a core concept of mission that reflected Ellen White's mission priorities at the time Secretariat emerged. From 1891 to 1900, she had served herself in Australia, en route to which she had stopped in some South Pacific islands. And as a result, I think White began to plead for greater efforts to reach Africa, China, India, Japan, and the islands of the South Pacific. In 1901, Arthur Daniels, who of course had worked with her in Australia, by now was the president, took her at his word and expressed, quote, his ardent desire to see a strong corps of workers sent to India and China and other Oriental countries. And probably to his surprise, Ellen White responded, actually, no, we should wait until our institutions, our sanitariums, publishing houses, and schools had reached a higher standard so that workers sent to foreign fields would be more effective. Now, you may say, well, why does Ellen White, having said we need to go to these countries, say, well, hang on, let's just wait? You have to remember this is the period of the conflict in the church between church leaders and those surrounding John Harvey Kellogg.
I see.
So, and we talked about that, and the chief source for many medical missionaries was the American Medical Missionary College in Battle Creek, which was run by Kellogg.
So what was she trying to say? Let's not export our problems to the rest of the world.
I think that's basically it. I think it's basically it. And thanks to the reforms undertaken in 1901 to 1903, which we've had separate episodes about, church finances and organization began to improve. You might recall we talked about how indebted the church was in the 1890s. But also, and I think this is crucial, alternatives to the institutions in Battle Creek began to emerge. And at that point, Ellen White began to stress ever more clearly and emphatically that Adventist mission was to encompass what she called the whole earth, including those living beyond the bounds of Christendom. She increasingly emphasized mission to adherents of non-Christian religions during the last 15 years of her life. And so Secretariat has as its priority what was Ellen White's priority at the time Secretariat was being organized.
But David, there are a lot of people, and I've heard this from many, who think that we only started reaching or trying to reach non-Christians around the 60s. From what you're describing, this was already an emphasis in the early part of the century. Did we have any success with that? What was that like?
We had some, and it's clear that for Spicer, and not just for Spicer, but for his successors as GC Secretary in what I would call the golden age of Adventist mission, which is sort of roughly 1903 to 1970, his successors as Secretary, Cecil Myers, Milton Kern, Ernest Dick, Denton Reebok, and Walter Beach. For all of them, the chief desire was to enter unentered territory and to preach Christ to those who did not know him. Not just to preach Seventh-day Adventist reformist truth to other Christians, but to preach Christ to people who did not know him. These leaders, particularly Daniels and Spicer, who had worked closely with Ellen White, had internalized and now began to implement Ellen White's perspective on reaching the whole earth. I think this was the overarching objective of Daniels and Spicer during their presidencies, and of Spicer's protege and successor as President Charles Watson, who was president in Australasia, had actively promoted mission to Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. Now, of course, all these men, and these church leaders were all men, of course, it was a different era, but they all wanted to see the home fields converted too. They didn't want to see mission fields converted at the expense of the home fields. But they believed the counsel of Ellen White, which we've quoted before but is worth quoting again, her counsel that the prosperity of the home work depends largely under God upon the reflex influence of the evangelical work done in countries afar off.
That's very strange.
Why is it strange?
Because, look, you've got a certain number of resources that are given to you.
Right.
And you can invest in the location where you are, or you can say, no, I'm going to raise my eyes, I'm going to look to the world, and I'm going to focus on this other land because that's the mission, is to proclaim the three angels' messages in those lands. And somehow, we're going to grow locally.
And that's what Ellen White says. If you look afar, it will strengthen you at home. And I think that's partly because it comes down to the nature of Christianity. The nature of Christianity is looking beyond yourself. If we're only looking to ourselves, then there's something wrong, because that's not the essence of Christianity. But I think also what happens is that church members, Adventists particularly, love mission.
Yes.
And that's one reason we get viewers and listeners for this podcast, because it's about mission. Adventists love mission, and so when Adventists can see that their church, and I don't just mean the whole church, I mean even their local church, is taking mission seriously, then they will give generously not only for foreign missions but for the work at home as well. And so Daniels and Spicer believed this, and so did the other men that I've talked about. And Spicer actually wrote, when the witness has been born abroad, the work may be finished at home in short order. The reflex influence of a missionary crusade that shall sweep the world will of itself prepare believers to rise and finish the work in this country. So as the work you do in order to go around the world will also inspire people to do the work here, wherever here may be.
I just made a connection with my mom. When we grew up, she would always help other children, other teenagers, other people. And she would always say, look, we need to help as many people as possible because one day somebody's going to help you. And if you take care of God's children, he's going to take care of your children. And there is something to that effect here. And I noticed he used Ellen White's language here. There's a reflex effect on mission locally. For part of this period, Ellen White was alive. What was her relationship with, especially Spicer and Daniels? Did they like each other? Did they talk much?
Oh, yes.
She was in California at this point. I presume that made
That's
difficult.
true, but she writes. She comes to a couple of GC sessions. She comes to the 05 and 09 GC sessions. And Daniels and Spicer visit her when they're in California, and of course she writes to them. Now, at times, Ellen White rebukes Daniels for not doing what she believes or what God has shown her he should be doing. And at times she's quite frank, almost brutal with him. But she had worked with him for 9 years in Australasia, and she was a mentor in effect. So the fact that they know each other means she can speak quite frankly to him in a way, and probably in a way that was good for him, because nobody else was probably doing it by that stage, and it was probably useful for him as a GC president to be grounded again and reminded that that there are other perspectives just than the president's own. I think that's probably a challenge that faces every General Conference president, to remain grounded and remember that he doesn't necessarily have the answers to everything. I think that's been a challenge for every president.
Yeah, they don't.
No, because and especially
nobody does.
Nobody does. No
Yeah.
one person does, and that's what Ellen White says.
Which one of them moved from being president to being secretariat?
All right, so in 1922, Daniels had been president for 21 years, and
Okay.
people had had enough of him.
I can see that.
You know, after 21 years, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly that he did wrong. He's just, people have had
Time
enough. It's time for a change.
Something.
And so he and Spicer swap offices. Spicer becomes General Conference president, and Daniels becomes General Conference secretary. That actually doesn't last very long, because Daniels, having been president, just isn't very interested in doing the job of the secretary. And what he instead does is starts the Ministerial Association, which is the association for all Adventist pastors that's intended to take care of Adventist ministers and pastors. So it becomes a crucial work, and that becomes his role in the last years of his life. But initially, for the first couple of years, he is the GC secretary and Spicer is the GC president.
Okay.
But both of them got on well with Ellen White. Both of them accepted her counsel. She listened to both of them because they were all effectively on the same page in what they were trying to achieve and where they thought the church should go. And, you know, of course, they were happy in all mission fields to see Catholics, members of Orthodox and Eastern churches, nominal Protestants of other denominations. They were happy to see all of them converted and become more authentic followers of Jesus. But all of these world church leaders had a particular burden for converting adherents of what missiologists today call world religions. That's Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and the Chinese traditional religions that are often summed up as Confucianism and Taoism, which are related. And so you find Ellen White in this period constantly writing about India, China, Japan. She also talks about Africa, but then Islam is important in Africa, but also you have what's called African traditional religions. The church is very successful in converting adherents of African traditional religions. It doesn't have so much success with Muslims. And in the end, Adventist missionaries default to trying to convert local Christians, members of indigenous Christian churches in the Middle East.
So we've been doing that for a long time.
We've been doing that for a long time.
Try our best to reach non-Christians, and it's hard, and we find much easier to reach Christians.
And this is on almost a cycle, Sam. Historically, we've started by trying to reach local Christians. A church leader or group of church leaders say, wait, the majority of the population in this country belongs to a different religion. We should be trying to reach them rather than just members of this tiny minority. They try it. It doesn't work. They default, but it's almost as though the church default setting is to try and reach other Christians, perhaps because Adventism did start as a reformist message for other Protestants. But we've gone far beyond that. But so it defaults to that, and then a new group of church leaders come and say, wait, the majority population belongs to this religion. Shouldn't we be trying to reach them? They try, it's difficult, they go back to trying. So it's almost on a cycle, and every 20 or 30 years, church leaders have to say, wait. But there was some success in this period reaching Chinese people, members of Chinese religions, and there was some success reaching Hindus.
Isn't it the case that we're not unique in this? We don't find the traditional Christian churches having much success in those areas either.
In the Middle East and Islam, you can look at, there is no church, there is no denomination, no missionary society, no group that has had great success in converting Muslims. None. But if you look at India and you look at China, Christian missionaries have had some success. And Adventists have had success, especially in China, and we're beginning to have a little bit of success in reaching Buddhists.
And of course, there's nothing wrong with reaching Christians in those places. You take, for example, India. It's a small population it's a small percentage of the population is Christian. I don't know, 7% or something. But in India, there's like 90 million people. It's bigger than the whole population of the United Kingdom. So it's not like God doesn't want them to hear about the good news of the second
No.
coming and present truth.
That's right.
God also wants them to hear. And I have another thought about this. There is a volume that is necessary if you're going to proclaim with a loud voice.
Right. You need a certain critical mass.
Right. So if you start with those that are closest already to those beliefs, those that have already given their lives to Christ, those that are somewhat expecting him to come, although that wasn't common around that time. But then you can build that critical mass of missionaries who now see the way that you do and the way that the Bible presents the end of times,
Yeah.
the end times. And therefore you have more critical mass to do the work that God inspired you to do. So it's not negative. It's just that the desire of Adventism has always been, to this day, to varying degrees of success, to reach non-Christians.
Yeah. And the first people to push that, it's not something that comes into the church in the 60s. The first people to push that are Daniels and Spicer in the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s. In addition to that, though, there's another role that Secretariat plays that I'd like to talk about, and it's related, though, also still again to the president's role. Arthur Daniels exemplified strategic planning, to use a term that was not used at the time. That is purposeful, big-picture planning for mission advances which weighed how an advance in one region might affect others, and took the calculations you made of that kind into account in decision-making. At the 1905 General Conference session, for example, Daniel sets out a strategic vision for greater efforts in mission in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So he's stressing areas that are not Christian.
Right.
And in fact, he drew attention to countries that were strongholds of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Islam. This is what he said. Who can tell, he asked the GC delegates, who can tell why 720 of our ministers should be located in America among 1/20th of the world's population, while only 240 of our ministers are sent forth to work for the other 19/20ths,
Ouch.
the other 95%?
Yes.
What good reason can be given for spending annually $500,000 of tithes among 75 million and only $150,000 among 1,400 million of the world's perishing?
Ouch.
We rejoice that we are able to name so many lands in which we have opened missions, but we deeply regret that in many of them our laborers are so few and our efforts are so feeble. We should materially strengthen our missions in Nyasaland, that's today's Malawi, in Rhodesia, that's today's Zambia and Zimbabwe, China, Korea, Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, Turkey, and Egypt. We should not delay any longer to enter such lands as the Philippines, Madagascar, Greece, Uganda, and Persia, today's Iran. All that started this movement, he continued, all that started this movement at the beginning and has urged it onward to its present position urges us with increasing emphasis to press on until this gospel of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Then and not till then will the end come for which we so earnestly long.
That's pretty straightforward.
It is. So in this speech, he does two things. First, he draws attention to the needs of mission in the non-Christian world, the 95%.
Yes.
This reflected the views of Ellen White, as we've already seen, and in fact, she plainly endorses Daniels in testimonies that she issues in 1909 and then again in 1915. In 1915, she amended the 1892 edition of Gospel Workers and she added a new paragraph, one of the last that she wrote, in which she declared, I feel intensely over the needs of foreign countries as they have been presented before me. In all parts of the world, angels of God are opening doors that a little while ago were closed to the message of truth. From India, from Africa, from China, and from many other places is heard the cry, come over and help us, which is, of course, a reference to Paul's Macedonian vision.
Yes.
This was literally her last word on mission. It's published just very soon after her death. She writes it soon before her death. So that's her last word on mission, which makes it all the more powerful, I think. So Ellen White endorses what Daniels says. But in that 1905 speech, Daniels did more. he modeled the concept of planning strategically based on the statistics provided by the GC Statistical Secretary, H. Edson Rogers, who we talked about last episode. You notice he has those statistics. You know, this many ministers, 5%, 95%, this much money, then this much money.
I can see why this is so special to you.
For the millions of people, you know, here, and we're spending this much for the 100,000 million people here. So it's full of data.
I can see why this will be special to you, because to some degree that's
what I do.
That's what you do, yeah.
Yes.
And it isn't. Sometimes we get the sense that we started these business processes as part of the professionalization of the church over the last 30 years.
Right.
Let's take best practices from the market, from the industry,
from the business world,
and let's apply it so that we can be efficient in God's mission as they are in their profiteering and their profit-making endeavors.
We promote a different kind of profit.
Sure. But no, this is 100 years old.
Exactly.
Right?
More than 100.
More than 100 years old.
Yeah, it's almost 120 years old.
So there's no pioneering in this particularly.
No.
But there is a good history and tradition of using statistics to provide visibility that informs decisions for mission.
And Secretariat embraces this approach and embodies it and provides the data that underlay much mission planning. And actually, at one General Conference session, Daniel observed, some find little that is of interest in statistical reports. Well, that's still true. But he said they have a purpose. The Lord saw wisdom in placing genealogical table statistics and historical records of various kinds in the Bible. And he recommended the statistical report to what he called all who occupy official positions. So that's Daniel's stance. And he actually says it's biblical. What we're doing here is actually biblical.
I arrived back in my office last week, and there was a book from your department.
The annual statistical
with the annual
report.
statistics,
Right.
and I've got it there to go through carefully and read it,
right,
to see if I can derive some insights from it.
Right, and so, for example, at the 1904 Autumn Council, Daniels himself, from the chair as president, led a discussion on what he called the needs of the mission field, and this included, as the minutes record, many items of comparative statistics, some of them Adventist, some relating to world population. And throughout Daniel's period as president, they prepare, and in fact he himself writes up reports using the data from Secretariat, or Secretariat prepares for him detailed analyses of different countries and their mission needs. And actually they're beginning in those to look at what we would call people groups. He's beginning to say, for example, in the Philippines, in the north you have a heavily Catholic population, but in the south you have a Muslim population, and you also have some who are still following traditional religions, what he would have called heathen or pagan, though that's not a term we'd use today. So they're beginning actually to differentiate that, yes, there's this country, but in this country there are these different groups of people, and we have to use different methods in reaching them.
So Spicer is the secretariat who's preparing these reports. Daniels is the president. Let's talk about this collaboration between them and how important that is to have the administration. And I presume the treasurers of the time were also very focused on this in the same way.
They are, because the president and all the other two officers are pushing it, but they don't have to push hard because the treasurers, and we've talked about this in a previous episode, are people who are in sync.
Yes.
The officers are all in sync.
And focused on the proclamation of these messages.
Absolutely.
To every country on the planet.
And they constantly hammer it. So, for example, in 1918, in Daniel's presidential address to that year's General Conference session, he said, "This conference should plan for a far stronger and more extensive foreign mission work than anything we have yet approached." This is 1918. It's still in war, but the end of the war is in sight. So he's basically saying, let's prepare for when the war ends, which they expect to be soon. He said, "No argument is needed in support of this proposal. The very character of our message demands it." So basically, I don't even have to argue for this.
This is who we are.
This is who we are, exactly. This is who we are. And then he stressed that looking into the future, we see some problems that bulk large on the horizon, which need to receive from us the most earnest, prayerful study that we are capable of giving them. And then he emphasized that where a limit to successful soul-winning work had been met, it arose in nearly every land we have entered from a limit to the number of workers and our facilities for carrying on the work. So he basically says we need more missionaries. We need more missionaries, we need more workers, because that's what's holding us back. It's not the difficulty of working among people. What's holding us back is that we don't have enough. And he concludes with these words: we aim at nothing less than the whole world. This conference should lay plans for more rapid strides and for mightier achievements. And I think actually those words could be repeated at every general conference session.
It reminds me of Pastor Biaggi, who keeps track of how many people are alive, and it's impossible for him to talk for more than 3 minutes without mentioning 7.9 billion and 8 billion now. And it's this drive to nothing less than every human being alive will do.
That's right.
It's non-compromising in this big picture.
Right. And by the way, those who are interested in the subject we've been talking about today might be interested in a book published by the General Conference Archives, which takes part of that quotations in its title. The book is called We Aim at Nothing Less Than the Whole World, the Seventh-day Adventist Church's Missionary Enterprise and the General Conference Secretariat, 1863 to 2019, and it's available on Amazon.
Wow.
So
I didn't know about that.
And we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
And so if people are interested, you can find out more by looking that. But again, the key thing is church leaders are planning. They're planning carefully. They're planning based on, if we go here, will that enable us to go there? They're planning based on statistics, not only church statistics, but world statistics. It's a very modern, it's a very contemporary approach to doing things.
And it worked.
And it worked. And again, you can't say that, we began being professional in the last 30 years, because we were doing this from 120 years ago. And Daniel's is always saying things like, we need to set goals, we need to make definite workable plans. And what he tells the 1922 GC session is, we need to make definite workable plans that should be entered upon at once, and every preacher, every church officer, every conference and institutional leader should have a part in implementing those plans. And Sam...
But isn't that what you've been doing recently with the new strategic plan?
Exactly. At last October's annual council, a draft of the World Church Strategic Plan for 2025 to 2030 was shared. It's called I Will Go. It's a continuation of the current strategic plan, which is also called I Will Go.
Yeah.
But some things have been changed to reflect changes in the world and in the church. So there's a few different priorities, but essentially it's the same. The draft will be improved over the next few months and brought to annual council of 2024 for approval. And as we consider this strategic plan, there is still the need, I think, that Daniel's mentioned for every preacher, every church officer, every conference and institutional leader to take an active part in implementing it. Because, Sam, only by concerted, united action will we be able to reach the world. And of course, we aim at nothing less than the world.
That is amazing. One thing that strikes me, David, in that process is they didn't become too orderly. Because there is a temptation when you like planning to plan so much that you don't have any spontaneity, that even the Holy Spirit will struggle to move you in any given direction. But they didn't fall into that. The work of mission was already so difficult, and things often went against the plan, because you plan for one thing,
right?
According to everything, this is the direction. Then you get there, and it's not what you expected, and the Holy Spirit will guide you in a slightly different way.
Right.
But that does not negate the need for planning. So there is this constant dance between we're going to plan as much as we can, but we're going to be humble and open to what the Holy Spirit is doing. That seems to me what they were trying to do it then.
I agree.
What we're still trying to do it now.
And what we're still trying to do now. And do we always get it right? No, we don't. But that's what we try to do. And I think they did get it right in the 1920s and 1930s and the 1910s. Because the planning is done at the center, but they understand once the missionary gets out into the mission field, it's up to the missionary to do the work, and he or she has to do it according to what they see in front of them. So there's not an attempt to plan and regiment everything down to the lowest order. Instead, they're saying, this is we're going to remember. The General Conference in 1901 to 1903 moves to becoming an organization that resources foreign mission. Union conferences manage their own affairs. The General Conference provides things that links the whole church together, like the Sabbath School Quarterly, but it also gathers resources so that the church where the church is strong can support the places where the church is weak or non-existent.
And as we talked before,
But so they take the resources and they say, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to recruit more missionaries and we're going to send these missionaries. But once the missionaries go, it's very much up to them. And we've seen that in many of the stories that we've told.
in some of the episodes, we covered people that the church sent who were in their early 20s, mid 20s,
Yeah.
even early 30s. The church entrusted the future of our work in a new territory, in a new country, to young adults,
Yes.
which is amazing to watch. And I hope that we can recapture that spirit and give them autonomy once they get there.
I think that's right. I think we need to get back to that. And it is remarkable the trust that they had and the understanding that once you're there, you might be able to communicate with us for months. So you've got to pick this up. You've got to take it. You've got to drive it forward yourself. And so I do think they have a wonderful attempt to have concerted action at every level, from the top, pulling resources and directing them, down to the missionaries on the ground and the people who pray for them and support them.
One of the advantages of today is that communication is fast, effective, and immediate to most parts of the world, which means that there can be greater supervision, which means that there could be greater reliance on the local missionary to whoever sent them. But at the same time, this removes autonomy and the need, and in fact the opportunity for them to figure out problems on their own, which will strengthen their faith and their commitment and the results, afterwards. So again, there's a balance there that must be struck between learning from the experience of others and figuring things out on your own and experiencing that autonomy. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam.
And thank you for joining us in this episode of Mission 150. Please keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or listening on your favorite podcast platform. And if you've enjoyed this episode, of course, please share it with your friends. If you want to know more about Adventist missionary work and missionaries today, go to AdventistMission.org. That's AdventistMission.org. And if you want to find missional opportunities today, go to VividFaith.com. We'll be back next week with more on the inspiring history of Adventist mission around the world.